the interest of time, I think maybe we should go ahead and get started and then let folks continue to join. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to IWIL's program, A Legal Guide to Understanding and Preventing Suicide and Other Mental Health Emergencies in the Workplace. Today, we are shining a light on a really critical issue that affects not just the legal profession, but obviously our society as a whole. So we're really honored to have Dr. Sally Spencer-Thomas here with us today. She is an internationally recognized leader on this subject, and she collaborated with the American Association of Suicidality, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and United Suicide Survival International to release national guidelines for workplace suicide prevention. So we're really excited to have her here today. Before I kick it over to Anne and Sally, I just want to invite you to please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A. The chat function will be open during this program because Dr. Sally would like to be able to ask some questions and interact, but we really hope that we can keep everyone's attention on what Dr. Sally is talking about in the moment. And so we hope that maybe you could really refrain from using the chat otherwise during this time. So over to you.
All right, so I'm Dr. Ann Bradford. I'm with the Institute for Wellbeing and Law. And I just wanted to start out with giving some of the data, some of the background on lawyer behavioral health. Let me get my slide up. All right, can you guys see my slide?
No. Well, let me see if I have. Oh,
Got
there
it now?
you go.
Okay, excellent. So I've been working on putting together kind of the best evidence of what we know about behavioral health in the legal profession. There have been several studies over the past 8 years. I'm sure many of you have seen a number of them. They've looked at the prevalence and predictors of behavioral health disorders in the legal profession. They've examined things like depression, anxiety, risky alcohol use, and suicidal thinking. And the studies have varied in their findings and also vary in their limitations, sort of what we can infer from them due to their size, the sample sizes, and some of the methods that they used. But the overarching message from these studies is that whatever the prevalence of behavioral health disorders, we need to take them seriously. The law profession does extremely important work, and these conditions can impair legal professionals' competence to perform their work and their personal well-being. It's also important to understand that these conditions are often interrelated. So for example, major depression and alcohol use disorders often co-occur, and both are predictors of suicide. Although national CDC data reflect that the legal occupation doesn't have a higher suicide rate than other occupations, suicides have been on the rise generally. And no organization wants a suicide to happen on their watch. So today we're looking forward to learning what employers can do to prevent suicide by one of the leading minds on the topic. Sally, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Anne. All right, let me grab the screen. There we go. Wonderful. Well, I'm going to start off with the story. And as I share the story, I want you to tell me who I'm talking about, and you can put your answers in the chat. This person was born in 1809, and when they were just a toddler, their infant brother died. When they were 9 or so, their mother and great aunt died within 2 weeks of each other from milk poisoning. They were subsequently raised by their older sister. She died when they were 19, and then a good close friend died when they were 26. Now, it wasn't uncommon in this day and age to have multiple losses like this, but a lot of people think that all of that loss contributed to what happened to this person in their early 30s. They grew so despondent that their friends worried for their safety. They took away all their razors, pistols, knives, anything they could use to hurt themselves. This person said, I am the most miserable man living. To remain as I am is impossible. I must die or get better. Now, this man had a friend, and his friend's name was Joshua Speed. And a lot of people don't know this part of the story, but Joshua Speed stayed with this man through the long, dark night of the soul, made sure that he was safe and had a companion to walk with him. And ultimately, many of us believe, ended up changing the course of history for our country. So in the chat, who am I talking about? That's right, William. Abraham Lincoln, winner, chicken dinner. Abraham Lincoln, wise man, said, a tendency toward melancholy, let it be observed, is a misfortune, not a fault. So even way back then, before we had the brain science and the psychology expertise that we have today, this man knew that this was not about moral failing. And so that's why we're here today, because we need to cultivate Joshua Speeds in everyday living. We can't leave it up to the mental health providers, because where are they? They're behind closed doors, helping one person or one family at a time. They're not out on the front lines, especially in a community that might be reluctant to raise their hand and say, I need help. So while I do a lot of work in suicide prevention, and I have been a psychologist for way long, this is the reason that I'm here. This is my younger brother, my only sibling, Carson. And Carson was a 34-year-old business leader, father of two, when he died by suicide on December 7th, 2004. Like many of you, this was my before and after moment. My life before his death and my life after his death were very different. You see, I'd actually been a psychologist and been in the field of mental health for close to 16 years, if you count my undergraduate degree, at the time of his death. So I thought I knew a thing or two about suicide. I actually honestly knew that I was underprepared. Dirty little secret for our profession is that if you get trained at all, a lot of times you get trained to be afraid. You get trained on how to document so that your documentation will hold up in court if you get sued. You get trained on how to do predictive risk assessments, which we now know don't have a lot of utility. And so you get trained to be self-protective and not really how to help. And I knew that, I felt that before his death. So my very first conference was a suicide, I would call it suicide curious conference, because there wasn't a whole lot there in there for prevention. My very first research project was with the Denver Police Department, helping understand what their response to civilian suicide was. And I did an extra externship on my internship at the Boston VA Medical Center to get some experience in the ER, trying to understand what people were going through. And nevertheless, when my brother came to his mental health emergency at the end of his life, as he fought valiantly against bipolar condition, I gave everything I had with all the tools and the things that I knew. We knew he was in trouble. We had conversations about suicide. We connected him to resources, and we still lost him. And it was absolutely devastating. We were extremely close, and he lit up the world in many ways. So afterwards, we pulled together our little family, his close friends, anybody who would listen, to figure out what was the goal, big gap-filling thing that we could do, because what we were doing wasn't working. What's the big gap-filling thing we could do? Something that wasn't being done before that would make a difference and maybe save lives like my brother, or at least help people not despair in isolation. So we looked at the data and we say, hey, it turns out there's a pretty specific demographic that's making up most of the suicide deaths, and that's men in the middle years. About 80% of people who die by suicide are male. Most of them are in the middle years, the working years. Most of them have one attempt and it's fatal, so you don't get the big red flag often of a suicide attempt. And most of them don't ever step foot in any type of mental health service. Well, that seemed like a pretty important gap to fill. So where are these middle-aged people? Because it's not just men, of course, but they were making up the biggest part of the demographic. Where are they? They're not in the school system anymore. They are also not accessing healthcare on a regular basis. Where are they? They're working, or they were just working, or they have an immediate family member who's working every single day. So it's the workplace that's arguably the cross-cutting system that we have for suicide prevention. And yet the workplace is woefully underprepared. Nevertheless, my colleague, another psychologist, and I, we put our heads together. We started building things based on an evidence-based model by the Air Force back in the late 90s. The Air Force, large enough community sample, went through what has now become the upstream, midstream, and downstream approaches to suicide prevention. They did it consistently, full court press for 5 years, and lo and behold, their suicide rate dropped 33%. That's not a small drop. That's not just a statistical significance. That is a community significance. 33% is a lot of lives. And it wasn't just suicide that dropped, but also homicide and family violence and accidents and all kinds of things dropped. And we said, okay, well, that's the best evidence model we have. Let's build from there. So we did, and we built this thing called Working Minds. It was a training, it was a strategy, and we were like, woohoo, you know what? We've got something that's probably going to work. And we went out to all the employers and we were like, hey, how about some suicide prevention for your workplace? And they were like, no, hard no, not our lane. And also way too scary. Liability monster hiding in the closet. They were so scared. So it was a long slog from that 2007 date to today. But a lot of things happened along the way that eventually bring me in front of you. And slowly but surely, the idea caught on, and it really caught on in the male-dominated industries that had high suicide rates. But we also started to get more credibility. We got more credibility by the CDC coming out with some data ranking industry by suicide rates. Some underscoring of the importance of this from the Attorney General and other kind of mental health commissioners like the WHO. The World Mental Health Day theme this year is workplace, so we're getting there, but it took a while. But today I'm really grateful because I have seen workplaces work magic, not by offering a one-off training or a one-off awareness day or checking a box around having an EAP, an employee assistance program, but really doing a deep dive in cultural and systems change. So I'm grateful, and it's not joy that makes us grateful. It's gratitude that makes us joyful. And I am so grateful to be connected to the Institute for Wellbeing and Law, because when we aligned on this value of cultural and systems change, I knew that I had found my people. And so I'm grateful to Denise and Tara and Anne for all the background work to making this come together, as well as all of you taking time out of your very full day and busy lives to make this a priority. Where we're going, by the end of today, I hope you can list at least 3 reasons why it's important to be proactive in this space and not wait until there's a mental health emergency, but really look at what prevention and mental health promotion are all about. And it's more than just promoting resources. Number 2, I hope you are able to at least describe some idea about what the national guidelines for workplace suicide prevention is trying to do. And also to apply a very well-known and evidence-based model of suicide risk that we affectionately call the Joiner model to the life of someone in this profession. Then at the very end, I'm going to ask you for your 30-day action step commitment. What's one thing in the next 30 days that you are willing to do to advance this conversation in some way? Maybe you'll do something for your own mental health. Maybe you'll check in on somebody you're worried about. Maybe you'll do some kind of system or cultural change in your own team or own organization. If none of you do anything differently as a result of this, we've all wasted our time. But if every one of you takes at least one small action step forward, that's momentum. And that's momentum that we can build on. All right, so we heard Anne talk about some of the trends and concerns in the legal profession, and I want to say that not only are they concerning, but they're also rising. A lot of people's mental health increased during the COVID years for all the reasons that we all experienced. But these are trends that are definitely concerning here. So with a raise of hands, so hopefully everybody has access to the little icons at the bottom. With a raise of hands, just a yes or no question. You don't have to tell us how, but have you had your own experiences with mental health, addiction, overdose, or suicide? Have you lost people to suicide, overdose, or the consequences of addiction? Or have you been a caregiver or support person for someone who is experiencing those things? If that is true for you, raise your hand. And I don't know that I can figure out how to raise my hand, but I don't know if you can see each other raising your hands, because I'm not seeing that. Anne or Tara or Denise, can you come off mute and tell me if the hand raising thing is working?
Yes, it is. So I can see it on the, if you click on participants, but I can
Okay,
tell you
I got you.
Yes.
Participants.
Yeah.
I see it. Perfect. Yes. So a good chunk of you. And that's the truth everywhere, that most people have been touched in one way or another. And depending on how broadly you define mental health struggle, really it's all of us. If we're honest, there's nobody who gets through this life without being brought to your knees by some kind of overwhelming thing that compromises our well-being, whether that's a breakup or a job transition or a loss or a health scare. We all have our mental health compromised from one point or another. And so that's why we're here today, because this pretty much touches everybody. All right, so now we're going to make the more than the nice to have argument, we're going to make the business case argument of why this is so important. Again, to be proactive, to have systems and cultural pieces in place that are designed to uphold employee well-being. This is a big pain point, employee engagement. Increasingly, employers are having difficulty attracting and retaining top talent, especially with the emerging talent that's coming into the workforce. They're not going to stick around very long if they're feeling mistreated or that their whole being, their whole self is not being respected. You know, when you came of age through COVID, you learned a thing or two about how fragile sometimes our world is. And so knowing that, you know, life is short. They have a real keen sense awareness of that. I have 3 Gen Zers in my home, and I sense that with them every day. So employee engagement is important. We also know that depression is a #1 driver of absenteeism. And then there's this thing called presenteeism, where people show up, but they can't actually get work done because they're so distracted or overwhelmed with their mental health situation. So all of that is showing up as costs to an employer. Then actually there's legal issues that emerge when mental health is not being treated the same way as physical health, and that people actually have a ground to stand on to say, this is discriminating against me. There's emerging legal cases abroad, not so much in the United States yet, but abroad, that are holding workplaces accountable for knowingly perpetrating psychosocial hazards that cause harm to people's mental health, just as if they left holes open in the floor or had their electrical outlets poorly wired so people were getting shocked. You know, if you're knowingly leaving hazards open in a work site and not doing it, and then somebody gets hurt, then you're accountable for that. So it's the same kind of idea. And we're seeing more and more of that in the UK. And then in health and safety, obviously, lots of our stress-related illnesses, heart disease in particular, are definitely connected to distress and other types of mental health conditions, and drinking habits and all kinds of things. But what we don't always make the dots on is that errors and safety problems are also connected to people experiencing poor mental health sometimes, because the distraction, the fatigue that comes with fighting things like depression and anxiety is real. The overwhelming thoughts that can come with depression and trauma reactions, they're real, and they impair our ability to make decisions and to juggle multiple roles and all of the things that we can do when our brains are fully functioning and well. A lot of the disability leave is also connected to mental health problems. And of course, deaths of despair. We're the only developed country where our life expectancy is going backwards. We are living less and less long, and we are not happy people. Generally speaking, when we look at other developing nations or developed nations at the level that we are, people are living longer and happier lives. And we are very stressed out, very burnt out nation. So why does this pertain particularly when we look at people in the legal profession? And again, I'm not an expert here, but I did do a little bit of due diligence in reading some of the things in preparation for today. And I can tell you, and also have lots of friends who are lawyers, that you tend to attract people who are very striving, very achievement oriented. But here's the kicker, also very self-reliant and problem solving. So pull yourself up by your bootstraps, put in your hard work, and you will get there. That's a core value of a lot of folks. And unlike some other industries, and I know there's pockets of the legal industry where a lot of teamwork is involved, but for the most part, you know, there's a lot of people working in solo areas, kind of with this striving and even competition with their fellow lawyers in a firm. So a lot of self-determination values, which is great until it isn't, because this is also a place that has high pressure, and I don't need to tell all of you about the pressure here. The pressure for more money, more authority, more reward, and the competition. And often I see this in a lot of the white collar industries, is that a lot of single source identity, and not just white collar. I also see it in military. I see it in our first responder community. Like, I'm a lawyer first. Like that's a big chunk of my identity. And it's not equally balanced across many of my other identities. I'm a lawyer first. And if that gets threatened or taken away, I struggle to really figure out who I am. I don't know who I am. So that there's a huge threat. I say you don't have a lot of eggs in your basket. So if you drop the basket, that's threatening because you might lose your one big egg. And so that's another piece that contributes to the stress and despair and leads to overwork because there's so much threat. If I lose this or if I don't keep striving, then who am I? And that, of course, eventually spills over into other areas of health and family and just well-being. You don't have time to do your recreational things or engage with your faith community. And so it's not unforeseeable that you get into maladaptive coping as just a way to deal with the pressure. So problem drinking or burnout, and then that can eventually lead to disabling or life-threatening depression, anxiety, addiction, and suicide. So, and then the last part of the circle is that it repeats itself. So once you get into that place where you're like, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. However, I'm a striving, self-reliant person, so I'm just going to go try to figure this out on my own. Just like any other health condition, eventually it becomes too much for us to handle individually, and we do need support. But people who have these high-profile roles where they need to put on, a certain sense of confidence and professionalism, sometimes are less likely to raise their hand and say, I don't feel so good today. I'm not my best self. So now I'm going to give you this model of suicide risk. This is what we affectionately call the Joyner model because a man named Thomas Joyner developed it a while ago based on how the risk factors and warning signs clustered together in his research. And, he found that there were like 200 known risk factors. And while I guess that's interesting, that's not useful. It's not useful to try holding 200 things in your head when you're trying to have a conversation about, should I be worried about you or not? So he found that these things actually clustered together in three main areas that predict a lot about who is going to be more at risk for suicide than others. So I want to walk you through this briefly, and then I want to invite your thoughts on how this model applies to people in the legal industry. So the left side of the Venn diagram is what he calls desire for suicide. I think today we'd probably say it's not so much a desire for suicide per se. With a lot of people, it's more of a desire to escape or find relief from unremitting and intense emotional pain. And this is a common experience. If we're really honest with ourselves, we've probably hit that wall of really intense emotional pain. And when you factor in these other things, you can see how people can really start to be in a despairing place around it. So there's about 15 million people in our country, in the United States every year that will have serious thoughts of suicide, not just even fleeting, but serious. They're staring it down. And they get there largely because of this perceived burdensomeness, the idea that I feel like a burden. I feel like I've caused harm to the people who love me. Maybe it's financial, maybe I have a health condition or a mental health condition or an addiction, and I don't want people to worry about me. Or maybe I've done something humiliating and I brought pain to my family or my community. Something's going on there where I feel like I've done something that has caused a burden or harm to other people. And then the second part of the equation is, and also I feel profoundly alone, not just like I'm lonely because I live by myself, but like there's no one here for me and I want it, but I can't have it. I want to have relationships. I want to belong to communities, but I can't have it, or I had it and I lost it. So these two existential questions that human beings wrestle with their entire life, do I matter and do people love me, are really at the heart of suicidal despair. And when those things are threatened, then suicidal despair usually pops its ugly head. And I shouldn't say ugly head because I actually think suicidal thoughts are a warning sign, just like anger is a warning sign and fear is a warning sign. Suicidal thoughts pop up because things need to change. And that's how I like to reframe it for people. They're not good or bad. They just are. And it's a signal that things need to change. And most often these things need to change. I need to feel like I matter, and I need to feel like I'm loved and I belong. 15 million people have that kind of experience every year. So I want to part of the equation, but only 50,000 people die. All right. So where this overlap is. So that's good odds, right? 15 million people stared it down, 50,000 people died. Of course, every one of those 50,000 people matter, and that's not a small number, but the chances are good that not only you're going to live through this, but here's the other story we don't tell. Most people grow through it in some way. Having suicidal intensity, as we like to call it, is a wake-up call. And it's at that point in time that a lot of people change their life. They get sober. That's a big one. They get into therapy. They get on the right medication. They leave a toxic relationship. They leave a toxic job. They get better. They actually grow. And it was the suicidal moment that got them to turn around. All right. So a lot of people have that. A lot of people also don't do it because it's frightening. So fear stops people. So the third part is this idea of I want to and I can. Capability is the third variable that comes together in a perfect storm. And there's a number of ways that people build that capability. There's some folks that just come into the world fearless. They're risk takers. They're maybe reckless. They have a lot of adrenaline. They do stuff that other people can't do because it's scary. I work with a lot of construction workers, and boy, do they fit the bill there. You think about what if we didn't have people with that sense of fearlessness? We'd have no warriors. We'd have no first responders, no emergency room physicians, no pilots, no entrepreneurs, no construction workers, no oil and gas folks. People who do daunting things every day that take a lot of courage and perseverance through fear. However, when any of those people get thoughts of suicide that I just listed, they are much more likely to be lethal on first attempt. So hardwired to be fearless is one. Number two, people get capability because they've had significant trauma. So trauma is very connected to risk for suicide. Why? Well, because you've already walked the path of life and death. It is a familiar road. And this is all kinds of trauma, childhood trauma, military trauma, sexual trauma, all kinds of trauma connected to risk of suicide. And the third way that people have capability is they know what to do. They have access to, knowledge of, and familiarity with lethal means. This helps explain why people in the healthcare profession have increased rates of suicide because they know what kind of medicines can kill them and they have access to the medicines. It also explains why people who own firearms have increased rates of suicide by about fourfold. It's not that they're more suicidal. It's that if you experience suicidal thoughts and feelings and you have access and knowledge of and familiarity with the firearm, you're probably going to use the firearm. And that, of course, has high lethality. So all of this comes together in a perfect storm. So now in the chat, I want you to write why might people in the legal profession feel like a burden at some point in their career or feel profoundly alone, either when they're entering their career, maybe in law school, or maybe in different types of circumstances in the industry or in certain types of occupational threats or hazards that come along with the territory. What have you seen? What have you experienced where they might feel like a burden or feel profoundly alone? Just put your thoughts in the chat. Overworking and not feeling like they're contributing to society through their work. Thank you, William. Yeah, I mean, when you, again, single source identity, if you're not being able to have the bandwidth to pay attention to parenting, for example, and your partner is carrying that, then you can feel that resentment. The feeling of competition, yes, and everyone considering you as a competitor rather than a friend, right? That's kind of a unique part of this culture, is that do I really trust my colleagues because they're all out to get the same golden apple as I am? Debilitating anxiety symptoms, Maggie, thank you. Yes, that can let people feel like an outsider if they don't hear other people talking about that as well. Solo practitioners, Sarah, I do think is a big part of this issue as well. A lot of solo entrepreneurs, solo people, not connected, not having time to be really engaged with their professional association. Lack perceived of success, right? Right. If the goalposts keep moving, then I'm not there yet. So therefore, I'm a burden in that way. Life depends on you, but you can't depend on others. Yeah, you're getting it on how this model applies to the unique stressors of this occupation. All right, so when we start to talk with partners about this, there's often a very predictable pathway. First, people are like, well, we got to generate awareness. Okay, yes. Yeah, you can't solve a problem that you don't know that you have. So let's generate some awareness. But I'll tell you, awareness isn't going to get you there. Awareness, we have a lot of awareness of a lot of things that we still do that we know are bad for us. A lot of them, right? So awareness doesn't get us there. But usually right alongside awareness, once we know that we got a problem here, people want to help or they want to help themselves. So we usually move into skill building. How do we have conversations about this? What can I do as a peer or a supervisor to help somebody else? Or what can I do to help myself? I don't want to be in this place. And then we get into this next section, which is really about strategy. How do we get to root causes? How do we implement upstream, midstream, and downstream? Lots of different approaches, evaluate, adjust, and make everything culturally resonant. So that's the deep lift. That's actually really sticky when we get to systems and cultural change. So I'm going to turn the needle now, and in the second half hour, talk about solutions based on the national guidelines for workplace suicide prevention. And this has been a long slog of a thing coming to fruition, but here we are. So we actually started with a task force back with the National Action Alliance 14 years ago. And then we started to say, oh my gosh, look at Canada. They have a set of psychological safety standards for their workplace. And then, here goes Australia. They got a position statement nationally to highlight this. And we started getting pressure to make national guidelines. So like, oh, something's so hard. Who's going to do it? There's no money. Then the CDC started coming out with their industry reports, ranking industry by suicide rate. Finally, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention said, okay, we'll support you in gathering some data to build these national guidelines. And we did it. We built surveys and focus groups and interviews across industries, public, private, nonprofit sector, across a bunch of different roles, HR, safety, peer support, well-being, executives, and lots and lots and lots of people with lived experience, people that actually lived through their mental health experience, whether the suicide, overdose, addiction, depression, anxiety, trauma, lived through it while they were working. And we asked them, what helped you? What didn't help you? What made it worse? What made it better? Then we got the second report. Then we launched the guidelines. When? Oh, the fall before 2020. It was a really opportune time to launch the guidelines, because when 2020 came out, boy, was there hunger. I don't know if you remember the early days of the pandemic, but there was all kinds of speculation of skyrocketing suicide rates, and everybody and their sister was worried about somebody. And so we had tons of people coming in the door right away. And we called them pledge partners because at the time, all we had was the guidelines and like a mechanism to pledge to make suicide prevention a health and safety priority at work. But as soon as they were done with the pledge, they're like, okay, we pledged, but now we don't know what to do. So we stood up a badging system, kind of like a self-paced badging system, and that was clearly not enough either. So then the next turn of events was that Anthem, Blue Cross Blue Shield Anthem, underwrote the development of our HOPE certification, which I'm going to touch on at the closing of today. And that was the lever that we needed to pull. How do we recognize and reward organizations that are doing full-scale implementation of upstream, midstream, and downstream? And then how do we measure that impact? So we had a pilot in New York State. We just finished a pilot in Colorado, and we're kicking off pilots everywhere. Now we're scaling, and it's super exciting. Idaho, Washington, Colorado, in 3 locations now, Texas, Arkansas, Phoenix just came in yesterday, and about 8 other states behind them. So we're really excited. So at the heart of the guidelines are these principles, and these were really called forward by the people with lived experience. They said, don't just make it a one-off thing and think you checked a box and now you're good. Like, integrate it into all the places that health and safety show up. And then they said, you know what? Don't just rely on volunteers who are passionate because it's the right thing to do. Invest in this. Invest in this like you do other forms of professional development, health, and safety for your workers. It will pay back in droves. They also said, don't expect just getting so-called troubled people to counselors is going to do the trick. We have very clear evidence, and I'll share with you what that is in a bit, that workplace itself drives distress and despair all the time. Just sending people to counselors does not fix it. We've got to fix the root cause, which is often all the things you just listed. Harm reduction at the very least in the workplace environment. We have to create a culture that does care about each other. And authentically cares and has compassionate curiosity. How do we do that? Especially at a place that is built on intense competition. How do we uphold people's dignity on their worst day and not just react with fear and what I call hot potatoing, where we're like, oh, we can't help you. This is too scary. Hot potato to HR. HR's like, oh gosh, we need to get you to the EAP. EAP says, wow, this is really important and intense. Got to get you to a specialist. Specialist is like, yep. They need to go to the hospital. Hospital's like, yeah, we can only hold you for 3 days. Out you go. Do you remember Thomas Joyner's model? What do people need more than anything? They need to know that they matter, and they need to know that they belong. And we hot potato the heck out of them. So having this experience of being held with dignity and respect and collaboration is key to success. We also need to get people beyond just the brink of suicide, where they're just hanging on by the fingertips, but into well-being and helping them live fully thriving, passionate lives. We need to do what we call empowered connection. So not just having a list of URLs and 1-800 numbers on a website somewhere, but building relationships with resources so that when you're in a place of doing a warm handoff, you can say, oh yeah, I know Dr. Mary from our EAP. I've spoken to her several times and she's going to take really good care of us. And there's that trusted handoff that is credible and accessible for people. And then lastly, don't just put up a bunch of posters and think you've done it. We need action. We need action around policies. We need action around training and a whole bunch of other things. So here's the mindset shift that we must get into if we're really going to do this right. A lot of times with all kinds of emergencies, we're focused on the downstream because that's where we realize we're in a catastrophic state. And obviously suicide is super overwhelming for people. And in a longer presentation, I would definitely go into all of these buckets in depth. But downstream stuff commands our attention. I call it drowning people in the river. You've got to focus on them, right? But without a plan, this is exhausting and it's overwhelming and we can't save everybody. So while we need a plan to address the mental health emergencies, we also need to get upstream from that and look at ways that people can identify themselves or that their peers can help identify when people are starting to struggle. Because just like other health issues, the earlier we get this, the problems are smaller and they're much easier to turn around. That's why we promote things like blood pressure checks and cholesterol checks and looking for lumps and bumps, because it's a lot easier to turn that around than stage 4 cancer or a full-on heart attack. Same thing here. Early identification, give people a buffet of things that they can choose to take them into their own recovery through their own agency. But the biggest rock in this whole thing is the upstream stuff. What are the upstream pieces we can put into place to prevent the downstream things from happening in the first place? And these are usually cultural and system types of changes. So workplacesuicideprevention.com is the place where all of this stuff is held. If you want to go inside there, kick the tires, all the practices and principles are in there, and there's a ton of stuff underneath it. When we created it, we made sure that it was going to be applicable to large organizations and small organizations, again, public, private, nonprofit, all kinds of different roles would see themselves in here and so on and so forth, all different types of industries. So far, so good. It's working. A lot of people have found a lot of benefit. So here's that same upstream, midstream, and downstream approach with the different icons that we use throughout the branding so that you can see how they look at, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. Upstream. What does this mean again? It means cultural shifts. It means reducing job strain and reducing bias. Some people call it stigma. I like to call it bias because then we have to own it, that it's our bias, not a brown cloud of stigma that floats around with people. But no, it's our responsibility, and also bolstering people's resilience and so on. So a big piece here is leadership. When we're partnering with organizations, I very quickly try to figure out who's in charge here, and what is their take on it? Because if the leaders are not involved in a meaningful way, then it's not going to work. I need at least somebody up in the top echelons who's going to raise their hand and say, yeah, this matters. It matters to the mission of our organization, and it matters to me as your leader because I too have been impacted. And I've been impacted myself. These are my experiences with mental health. I've been impacted my family or my loved ones. And I care about this because I know how important it is. There's nothing better than having a leader who says, you know what, clear my schedule on Thursday afternoon. I'm going to go to therapy and I'll see you Friday. Oh my gosh, that's just lovely for me because what they've done there is just model. This is a matter of fact thing. I take care of my health. You need to take care of your health. And that's what we do around here. It's brilliant. So my challenge to all the leaders always is be vocal, be visible, be visionary. There's no shame in stepping forward, but there's great risk in holding back and just hoping for the best because people model what the leaders do. And what the leaders recognize and reward and invest in, that gets traction. And those are big cultural change levers. And I have all kinds of examples of top C-suite people in very large companies saying, yeah, let me be the one to help lead this. I can model it. Let's go. And then, boom, all kinds of magic starts to happen. Not only hierarchical influence, but throughout the whole industry, people start leaning over and saying, yeah, me too. Who hasn't been brought to their knees by an overwhelming thing? All right, second upstream piece that I wanted to highlight for you is psychosocial hazards. And this slide is crowded by design because I wanted you to see all the psychosocial hazards at work that are connected to what? Suicide. In the literature, the more of these they are, the more likely they're going to have a suicide impact. So we've got job design challenges like job variety and job autonomy and effort reward imbalance. A big one is any kind of toxic interpersonal relationship, bullying, hazing, harassment. And the big one in there is a conflictual relationship with a direct supervisor. We also have all kinds of work-life disintegration, work spilling into home, home spilling into work. And this sense of lack of connectedness with the meaning of the work. I just feel like I'm a cog in someone else's profit making or someone else's, acknowledgement. I don't know what I'm doing here. This doesn't mean anything to me. And then a whole bunch of other things, work-related trauma, which I assume many in the legal profession get exposed to through criminal litigation and other types of traumatically related litigation, but also sleep disruption. Can't fall asleep, can't stay asleep, try to sleep and have horrible nightmares, or sleep and never feel rested. Some people drink to sleep. That doesn't count. A lot of people have sleep apnea, which is basically your brain trying to tell you you're dying all night long. So a lot of sleep disruption also connected to suicide. And then the big one here too that I've come to appreciate is a permissive alcohol culture. We have this in construction as well. I do a lot of work in construction. The norm of how drinking is handled is way higher than the norm in the general population, but it becomes the air you breathe because you surround yourself to it. So you don't even think of it as something that's not healthy. It's just what you and your peers do. But that permissive culture of alcohol does also lead, obviously, to a whole bunch of other mental health and health related consequences. So this was the thing that I saw and I was like, oh, this is brilliant. This is hanging up in a lot of job site trailers everywhere. It's NIOSH's hierarchy of controls. If you're in a safety critical industry, you know this, you know it because it's so important. Basically, NIOSH said, again, a lot of research behind it, is we're going to be they apply it to job site safety. So slips and falls and electrocution and all that jazz. They said we're going to be far more likely to have safety on our job site, nobody getting injured or killed, if we eliminate the hazards or mitigate the hazards to begin with, than if we only tell people they got to wear their PPE, reflective vests and steel-toed shoes. Yeah, reflective vests and steel-toed shoes can help, but not if there's uncovered holes everywhere and poorly ventilated window, hazardous material situations. No, we got to eliminate those hazards. So the same thing is true with psychosocial hazards, where we're going to be far more likely to have a workforce with high well-being if we eliminate or mitigate those psychosocial hazards than only tell people to breathe deeply and practice yoga and go to counselors. Are you with me? Yes. Okay. So in the chat, what do you think, given that list that I had up before, are some of the most pressing psychosocial hazards? You listed a couple before in the model. Are there others that you want to call forward that you're like, yeah, that really speaks to me? Yes, yes, Sharon, 24/7 workday, 24/7 workday, on call all the time, not able to connect into your other identities and duties and roles and things that bring you joy in life. Huge work demands, job insecurity. Yeah, that's a big one. When you're a provider and you don't know if you're going to have a job in 6 months, lack of autonomy, big one. That's so important that we feel like we have agency in our life and that we're empowered to make decisions. Sleep deprivation, no boundaries, prejudice and discrimination, no, something nobody has control on. All right. Great. I'm glad you brought all of those up because they are real and not, therapy all day won't get in front of that. We got to address that at the root cause. All right. So midstream is what we're going to do in the middle part, where we're going to try to get people identifying early in the course of their whatever, anxiety, depression, substance use issue, that maybe there's something here that could use some additional attention. And I'm not going to go into all the training aspects, but I want you to have a mindset of what training should look like. So everybody should get what I call the CPR level of mental health training. And there's a bunch of models out there. Mental health first aid is extremely popular, but it's long. So it doesn't always work for super busy industries that can't take a day to go through a training, but it's, a lot of people use it. There's shorter ones that can be done in a couple hours, at least get the conversation going. But the CPR model is really what I want to emphasize here, because we all understand how CPR works. You need to get it more than once, every 18 months or so, you need to refresh to bring it back to the top of the brain. So you're like, oh yeah, because chances are good you're not going to use it every day. You're going to forget, or you're going to feel too rusty to use it when you need it. We also know that CPR, you don't have to do it perfectly to get the end result of sustaining someone until we can bring in the next level of care. CPR, the chances actually aren't good that you're going to end up with a positive result. At best, you're going to break a rib, and chances are good that it's not going to work out the way we hope, but we still believe in it because it's our best bet to give people a second chance at life. So when it comes to training, think of it like CPR. How do we bake this into health and safety stuff that we already do? And what is our next tier? What is the EMT level, the advanced skills level that we need to build in? Because sometimes the very beginning idea of needing help and actually getting into professional help is too much of a jump for people. They need somebody in the middle, a peer, a professionally trained peer, or a manager who understands how these things work to be that liaison into services that could be helpful. I'm a huge fan of peer support, and I do know that there are different national initiatives in the legal industry, especially, I know they call it impaired physicians with physicians. I think it's, oh gosh, I forget the term, but the lawyers in long-term recovery who support one another anonymously and confidentially is huge. And it's so essential for people to maintain their sobriety. I think we can do more of that with other types of peer support in this industry, helping people with depression and anxiety and other things. Then downstream, how are we going to prepare ourselves for mental health emergencies? Well, one of the things that's often a missing link here is really knowing what the resources have to offer and how they work. So again, when we partner with organizations, we pull together, we call them a ground crew of mental health champions, 5, 10 people, depending on the size of the organization. And we deploy them to go kick the tires, maybe we do some secret shopping with the different resources to really understand, do they work? Are they responsive to our community's cultural needs? Do I trust them? Do they seem credible? And if so, let's build some relationships here. And this could be obviously not just the HR folks who have already done that, but people outside of HR. In the end user community that might be resistant to reaching into these resources. That's who we want to convince. That's who we want to get the barriers to come down for. And then what are the community and telemental health services outside of the benefit package? Because we can scream from the mountaintops all day, goes use your benefits. And there's a whole bunch of people that aren't going to go because they're like, I don't want my employer touching any of my mental health issues, not even close. And then we want to know about where to go for the best substance use and addiction recovery resources, because they're not all awesome. And when people get there, sometimes they just Google and what comes at the top of a Google search, but whoever paid the most for their advertising, not necessarily the best. So we need to give people the skills on how to discern where are the good ones. How do we know they're good? How do we get confidence that this is a really legitimate type of resource versus something that somebody popped up just to grab the money? We have them call 988, which I'll cover in just a second. And they have some more awareness about suicide and overdose bereavement support and how complicated it is and what some of the specialized resources are there. So there's a whole process. It takes about a quarter to iron out for people, but so rewarding for have people to say, and I quote, when I called 988, when I called our employee assistance program, and these are just everyday managers. This is not part of their job duty, but now they understand what to expect from the resources and they become a far more credible referral agent. So 988, if you haven't been aware, is a 911 for mental health emergencies. It's 24/7, call, text, chat. And if you haven't called it, I encourage you to call it. I encourage people all the time. And you could just tell them when you get there, this workshop lady told us to call. We're in a industry that has some risk around mental health emergencies, and we just wanted to know how it works. Do you have time to chat? That's it. Takes 10 seconds. Most often, like many first responders, a lot of our call centers, they're just waiting around all day for stuff to happen. They welcome your conversation. If they're busy, they'll tell you. But I would love for you to go through the experience on the front end. Let's just say you call, right away, you're going to get an automated voicemail. Press 1 and you'll get the Veterans Crisis Line. Everybody there knows everything about veterans, mental health, and where the resources are. Press 2, you're going to get a Spanish speaker. Press 3, you're going to get experts who help with LGBTQ plus 25 or younger. So that could be your emerging workforce. It could also be parents who are needing support for helping their children who identify as LGBTQ plus. If you're none of those identities, or you're not trying to support someone with those identities, you hang on. Eventually, it's going to get you into the call center closest to where you are physically. And then you get to have a conversation, and it's going to help you de-escalate the situation. That's what the call center call takers are best at, de-escalating the situation, getting clarity on what's happening, and then creating a plan. Yay. It's out of your hands. You don't have to worry about the plan. They're going to create the plan for now. And it's going to be a plan to keep them safe for now. They're going to help with follow-up, which is great, especially when managers are like, we don't know what to do. Do we call 911? Are we going to the hospital? We don't know. They're going to help you figure out what that plan is. And they're really going to do least restrictive types of intervention and a lot of empowerment. So befriend your local community call center and learn more about what they do. They'll really help you socialize that resource. And then the last piece I really wanted to, or second to last, I guess, I wanted to highlight for you is this incredibly cool emerging trend of recovery-friendly and recovery-ready workplace. It started off in a lot of our states, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Colorado, Nevada, where people are creating a process where organizations can get a certificate saying that they've done some things to be inclusive of people of long-term recovery in their community. And they are fully on board with supporting people in long-term recovery. And then some a little bit too about doing some harm reduction so that people don't end up in an addiction state because of the permissive culture of alcohol or drugs that exists. So the Department of Labor is also leaning into this. So I'm thinking probably within a year, this is going to be much more well-known national initiative. But part of it is really the willingness and the outreach of employing people in recovery and being ready to help them with their needs in that transition, especially coming out of sober living houses and so on. Encouraging help seeking and help offering inside of a workplace, making that a norm. We just look out for one another around our substance use issues, making sure access to services, that they're not inadvertent barriers there with policies or poor services, being able to offer accommodations so people can go do the things that are going to help them stay, especially when they're in a really difficult place with their addiction. A lot of prevention and education for things that are maybe root causes around addiction. For example, injuries or other things that lead people to get an opiate addiction through their medication system. Looking at what the barriers are and the biases are, and really just overall being recovery ready, making sure that the company is supportive and knows what policies and resources are out there that can support people in recovery. So some additional things to consider is like a company-wide statement says this is important to us, promoting lots of messages that recovery is possible. It happens all the time. It might not happen on the first shot, just like other major health challenges. There are trials and tribulations, but yes, people get into recovery all the time. Really looking at those policies, what are our alcohol use policies? What are our leave and return to work policies when people are out for, let's say, cancer or after a car accident? Are we upholding those same kind of dignified practices that let people feel like their struggle, their life and death struggle is just as important as cancer and heart disease and coming back from a major accident? How can we promote recovery through work by knowing where the meetings are and other types of supports that can be helpful for people? And then just regular training, highlighting all of this stuff and really bringing these resources to life. So that's the last thing I'm going to highlight is postvention. This is what we do after there's been a suicide death, because what we do in the aftermath speaks volumes to all the people left behind. And it is complicated. Coworkers are often the forgotten grievers, and they are often not included in the mourning rituals, especially if the family lives somewhere else. So there's just this empty, confused state, a lot of survivor guilt, a lot of trauma. Coworkers spend about as much time, if not more, with their coworkers than their family and friends. So there's relationships that happen. And when a suicide death or an overdose death happens, sometimes it feels so overwhelming for people. So here's a postvention guide designed for a manager who's also experiencing the trauma and grief of someone they cared about who died by suicide. So it's checklists and flip charts and flow charts templates for communication on how to notify the workforce that this is happening and so on. So moving forward, here's what I see. So in 2020, as I mentioned, in the middle of the pandemic, we created this self-paced badging system. It's still up there, you know, it's something, but we needed more. So in 2022, we launched Hope Certification. This offers a lot more support to organizations, and we do it regionally currently. So like I said, we've got regional pilots and cohorts popping up all over the place. We go deeper dive into all those 9 practices, a lot more tools and templates, and they try stuff on, and then they stumble around and trip over stuff in the implementation, and they come back and we troubleshoot. We've done it now to see that the cultural change is real. There's also accountability mechanisms to make sure people aren't checking boxes, but really delivering things at best practice. We partner with a third-party certification system to make sure that all of that's going well. And it's customizable to all kinds of different industries and types of businesses. Lots of mentoring that help it successful. But the secret sauce piece is because we do it in a cohort, there's lots of sense of community and struggle together, even when it's across industry. You know, we've had people in municipalities, we've had people in healthcare systems, we have a lot of people in construction coming together as community members in a regional community, try to figure this out for their teams and for their communities. It's so cool. So think of it like LEED certification, except instead of earning bronze, silver, gold, platinum for being a green organization, workplaces are earning bronze, silver, gold, platinum for being an organization that upholds worker well-being. And I see this as a huge future piece. All right, so in the chat, what is one thing that you will consider doing differently moving forward in the next 30 days? This is how we make change. You think about what's yours to do, you say it publicly in front of your peers, and you're much more likely to do it. So give me one thing, could be a small thing, could be for you, for your team, could be for other types of system or cultural change. Oh, thank you. Yes, checking in with 3 people who are survivors of suicide. Excellent. Lawyer assistance program. That's what I was trying to come up with. I knew it was right there. I just couldn't pull it all the way forward. Yes. Yes, the recording will be available. All right, excellent. Other people. Share with HR. Perfect. Listening to others. Good, good. Yes. Deep listening really is so curative. Sometimes we feel like we're not doing anything for just listening. No, listening is the thing. Listening is the thing. And it's so hard for decisive and problem solving people to really be present. Checking up on law school folks. Yeah. We had a big roundtable in Colorado a few years ago, 8 years ago. And we brought together really the most influential part of the legal community statewide. So the justices and the president of the bar associations and this big firm and that big firm and all these folks. And then they helped drive the credibility of it and the attendance. And we probably had 120 people sitting at rounds. And I was so moved. You know, when we created Safe Space for it, I was so moved by the stories that came forward. So many of them about this loss of law school friends. It was heartbreaking. So thank you, Allison, for checking in on them. Sleep. Yes. Count the victories. Great. Okay, cool. So in closing, this work is hard, and it takes a lot of littles and a lot of people working diligently to eventually make the cultural change that we see. But I love this quote because it gives me hope. Before the water turns to ice, it looks just as it did before, but then the few crystals start to form. P.S. That's you. And suddenly the whole system undergoes cataclysmic change. So thank you again, everybody, for coming in. I do have an evaluation. I have it here. No, shoot. Hold on. Give me a second. I really want your input on this since this is something that is really important and your feedback is essential for us continuing to improve upon this effort. So here is this evaluation. It really will just take you a couple of minutes. I'll pull the QR code back and that is the end. So thank you again, Tara, Denise, and Anne for inviting me. And hopefully this was what you had in mind.
Thank you so much, Sally, for that great presentation. For anyone who might have questions, I believe, Sally, you said there's a space on that on the
Mhm.
survey, right, for follow-up questions. So please
Yes.
go ahead and complete that. And if you have questions, you can get in touch. Sally, would you like to share your contact information as well?
Yes, I sure will. I just want to make sure everybody could grab the QR code if they wanted
Yeah.
to, but here's how you can get in contact with me. A lot of times people have personal kinds of things that they're worried about, then you can call me, email me, no problem. So,
Wonderful.
all right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank
Enjoy the
you
rest of your
very
day and
much.
have a great weekend.
Take care.